Hey guys, it's Dasha. Welcome back to my channel. Today I wanted to talk about the worst and most disappointing books of 2024. First and foremost, new setup with like actual lighting for once. If it looks terrible, it's not my fault, okay? I'm doing my best here. This is a test run for these lights, okay? For two, wow, it's the end of the year already. There's been a whole year of reading. This hasn't been my most like productive reading year in terms of number of books and like what I've accomplished, but I was finishing up my master's and that's what we'll blame it on. But overall, it's been a really good reading year. So there's not a ton of like bad books as opposed to like last year's Fourth Wing and a couple of others. It's been overall pretty successful. My average rating out of 5 is almost a 4-star of all the books I've read this year, which is pretty good. That being said, there's always a couple of duds. Most of these are in the disappointing category. There's really only a couple that I rated more lowly or couldn't rate at all. There's a DNF, but overall, it's just that I was pretty hyped for these and unfortunately it didn't work, which is always just the most heartbreaking thing because sometimes you think you know your reading taste and then you get let down. So I've got a lovely little stack and let's just get right into it. So the first one on the top of the stack, we'll just go in order of what I have, is 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. This was a DNF and this was in the firmly like disappointing to parts of it were bad category for me. This is a modern classic of speculative literature. It's firmly in the magical realism camp of that genre, and it's about a fictional family in this fictional town, and you follow them throughout generations of their lives and the lives of their descendants. This was, I'm gonna explain why it's disappointing. I thought this was gonna be for me. The way other people talked about this book, the way the prose just sounded beautiful and delicious, and the impact that this has had on other readers made me think that this was just going to be the book for me. And while the prose was just delicious, luscious, beautiful, the rest of the book I could not get behind. This book was just really weird, and I can get behind some weird, but it got a little too weird. And then you mix in elements of grown men sleeping with children, and it just gets to a point of weird where I cannot sit by anymore, unfortunately. And I know that's a hot take, and I know that there's an argument to be made about reading people through the lens of where they were at, what time they lived in, rather than today's standards. But I think in any society, it should be immoral to sleep with children. Just a hot take. But in general, it's one of those things that like I have a really hard time reading anything with children, any kind of horror that involves kids or something like this. So it didn't work for me in that respect, and the general magical realism of it all was just not the vibe for me. But this was genuinely some of the most beautiful writing I'd ever read in my life, and I'm curious like if I want to try him again, but this just really put a bad taste in my mouth. And for that reason, it's disappointing. Like, I thought I was gonna like this, and there's parts of this that were great, and I think that makes it hurt all the more because I could see the potential in it. There is a world in which this book works for me, but unfortunately it's not this one. The next book is a really similar case, and that's James Baldwin's Giovanni's Room. So this is another modern classic about a man living in Paris and kind of grappling with his identity as a gay man in a world that doesn't really want to accept him. And this was hyped for me personally. The reason this was disappointing was because I'd read James Baldwin before. I read The Fire Next Time, and it was fantastic. 5 stars. I think about that book often. It was just a lot of really beautiful writing and some really important messages wrapped up in this beautiful package that I know I'm gonna revisit over and over and over again. And so I was expecting that same lush language, but in a novel form. And while some of the prose in this did hit me the same way, there was a lot of interesting imagery and like just overall good writing. The problem for me in this was the misogyny. And again, it's one of those things I just couldn't get past. And I've had people kind of explain to me that, you know, in their view, it was the fact that gay men do face a lot of misogyny from the world because they are more feminine or whatever. And a lot of that gets kind of internalized and maybe projected outwards. But to me, like, that could be understandable if it was just a couple of times or if it was kind of not as violent as it had been, but I found it just truly not stomachable. I was not able to just sit with it and be okay with it. And this was characters espousing this that you were supposed to be rooting for and that you really wanted to see succeed against all odds. And yes, this is a tragedy. Like, I get that they're not going to succeed and you kind of know that going in. But at the end of the day, you want to be able to feel for these characters in order to feel their story and their tragedy. And it was hard for me as a woman to be okay with some of these things. And like, I'll defend that opinion to my last breath. I know it's not a popular opinion. I know there's a lot of women that do love this book, and I can see why. It's just a line that I could not cross, you know? Another book that was quite disappointing for me, that I just expected a bit more out of, was Legion by William Peter Blatty. So this is technically the sequel to The Exorcist. Yes, the book that spawned the famous movie about a young girl, the daughter of an actress, who gets possessed by a demon, and the stories of the people who are trying to save her a little bit, as well as just the actual possession and exorcism. So in Legion, you're following a couple of characters that you met in The Exorcist. Particularly though, you're following one main character. You're following a detective who is put on a case that is very similar to a case that he thought had wrapped up years ago. The killer had died, but the case is eerily similar, and you're kind of hearing the case through his eyes. You're not hearing the case through his eyes, you're following the case through his eyes while also hearing his inner monologue and kind of the things people are saying around him, and also just what he's thinking about this case. And this was disappointing because I truly loved The Exorcist. For one, I thought the book was fantastic. I've never watched the movie. That is a gap in my knowledge, I will acknowledge. But I never watched the movie, but the book was just fantastic. And my boyfriend, who'd read both and watched both, said that Legion would probably be better for me. He said he likes it more. There's that noir detective story kind of element to it. And he was like, this is gonna work for you. This is great. Like, I was in a reading slump. He's like, pick it up. You'll get out of your slump because it's a detective story, right? And while he was right on that front, it did work for me in terms of pacing and everything. It just kind of fell flat everywhere else. The detective you are following, whose head you are in, is a very interesting character. It was quite intriguing to be in his head and view the world the way he does. He's kind of jaded. He's seen so many things. He's got these really philosophical musings about everything that goes on around him. But ultimately, the themes were just a lot less interesting to me. The Exorcist had that core theme of like science versus the supernatural, and what do we do when we can't trust our own eyes and ears? What do you do when you're losing faith but your whole existence is reliant on it? Like, it was just really fascinating from like a being able to sink your teeth into it perspective, and Legion was sorely lacking that for me. Yes, the detective, our main character, is losing faith in a way, even though he is not specifically a man of faith in the same way that the priests in The Exorcist are. He's definitely someone who has seen all sorts of horrific things and is kind of grappling with them, but I just found it a bit less effective. The pacing and the plot didn't really work for me as well as it did in The Exorcist. Like, there's just a whole litany of reasons why it just wasn't as good as its predecessor, and it is a different story, and I get that, and it's maybe not fair to be like, this wasn't as good as The Exorcist, but for that reason, it was disappointing. I expected to like it, I was told I would, and it didn't work for me. So these next two are gonna be very hot takes, and they're both books that by all accounts should have worked for me 100%. They're books that by all accounts were up my alley. They are beloved. They are well-written books for the most part. They just really didn't work for me, and it's heartbreaking. I'm gonna go with the less controversial one, and that is Sword of Kaigen by Emma Wong. So this is an adult fantasy that was initially self-published, but it was then picked up by a publisher, if I'm not mistaken. And it's set in this world reminiscent of our world in the future, kind of in East Asia. Specifically, you're mainly following people who live in a country that is very reminiscent of Japan. Most of this land, this earth, and this country have kind of moved into the future a little bit, like we're not in our time, but the family you are following is living in an area of this Japan-esque country that is firmly set in the past. They chose to upkeep tradition and kind of live in like a very warrior lifestyle, very reminiscent of the samurai, but there's also that magical element in there, and so these warriors also have some level of elemental abilities, and not just them, but some warriors from other countries. And you're following this family who is kind of always preparing and training for war, and then one day war arrives at their doorstep. The reason I was so disappointed in this is because, first of all, like everyone who's read this just felt this massive emotional impact, and I love emotional stories. Robin Hobb's my favorite author. I love feeling pain. And while there was some of that in there, I didn't feel it as much as other people did. And the other reason I thought I would just love this is because everything about the story sounds interesting. It's this feudal warrior society with elemental magic, and there's really great battle scenes, and it's influenced by martial arts as well. And it sounds really cool. And I didn't love a few things about this that really brought down my overall enjoyment. I don't know if you're seeing glare on this. If you are, I'm so sorry. Like I said, I'm figuring this whole lighting thing out. One of the main things, like I said, for me was the emotional impact in this. I did not get what I wanted to get out of this. It's not that I didn't love our characters, but I just felt like we didn't have enough time to really get that deep impact. This whole culture that they're living in is very cold, and while you are in the head of a few characters, everyone's kind of kept at arm's length, and as the reader I felt like I was at arm's length. So when emotional scenes happened, I felt like I was still not fully invested in these characters enough to feel that emotional payoff. I also was very surprised at the pacing in this. It's very not traditional, and while that might work for some people, and I'll explain why in a second, it kind of didn't work for me. So you arrive to what would be the climax in any traditionally published book towards the middle of this book. The war arrives to this town, to this area, very much towards the 50-60% mark. While it's not bad, because the rest of the book is dedicated to rebuilding and grieving, and that could have been interesting, I found that it was just very jarring because, again, I feel like I was held at arm's length from these characters. So by the time we're getting to the rebuilding and like healing and grieving, I felt like I still didn't really know these characters enough to want to go through that process with them. I also resent the fact that this was pitched to me everywhere as a standalone, and a standalone it was not to me. I found it really frustrating that at the end we're introducing new elements and new potential plot beats. And like I said, like I was pitched this as a standalone. I expected to go into this and get a self-contained story. I understand that there's other stories in this world, but I found that really deeply unsatisfying when I was under the impression that this would be a standalone. Whether that's the fault of the author for pitching it that way or everyone else just parroting that when they talk about this book, I don't know. But yeah, like the little extra details at the end that kind of set up for a later story just made this like deeply unsatisfying to read. So overall, that's why it was disappointing. Like, this was not bad by any means. This is a good quality book, especially for a self-published novel. There's a very high amount of care and editing that went into this, but it didn't work for me. This next one is very deeply upsetting to me personally because I have read this author before and I have loved him. And I've talked about this book before, so if you've been watching my recent reads, you will have seen this, but that is The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. This is the first book in the Stormlight archive, and this is his magnum opus series. It's this grand, expansive fantasy set in this cool world where there's like storms that ravage the lands, and there's all these different countries and cultures and clans, and you're following a cast of characters who are going on their own personal journeys. And I hated this. So I have read the entire Mistborn Era 1 trilogy as well as Warbreaker, so I'm familiar with Brandon Sanderson, and I've always had issues with his characters and his prose. In the Mistborn series especially, I found the prose really simplistic and the characters were just a little cookie cutter, and I can forgive that because everything else just felt like it fell into place. The plot, the world, the magic, really fun, really enjoyable, just like good fantasy, right? But this was always pitched to me everywhere as his best work, his magnum opus, this most incredible feat of fantasy writing, and to me it was not. This book was way too long. I found poorly written. I find this world frustrating and not well done. And overall, it did not click. And I feel kind of insane. Here's the thing. You are given a monumental task as a fantasy author of not only introducing readers to your world, but to your characters and to the important plot beats and little nuances. And that's hard. I will never sit here and say that I could do it better than he could. Absolutely not. He's at the top of the game in general, his game and the game in general. He is the top fantasy author right now, if I'm not mistaken. But I found the work in here very lacking. The character work was quite shallow and not great, and I understand that these characters are going to go on arcs, but I found them very lacking nonetheless and a little stiff. The one character that I actually cared for, I realized, was because Sanderson had actually gone through the effort of giving him backstories and like flashback scenes. So of course I'm gonna care more about him. He actually got work put in to make us understand why he was the way that he was. When it comes to the world building, I found this was just so horrifically info dumpy in a way that was not enjoyable. There was so much time spent on needless details about this specific culture or that specific culture, and about this specific hat or this specific clothing item or this specific custom, that I found we were taken away from the actual immersion of the world, and it kind of felt like you were getting an encyclopedia of Roshar thrown at you the whole time. I understand that this is a massive world and small details will come back later, but he also insisted on like focusing on some small details so heavily that you could tell that those were going to be the important ones, and then things that actually emerged towards the end of the book as like these reveals or like these like, oh, but watch what happens here next. I didn't remember them because there was 1,100 pages or whatever it is of other information being thrown at us previously. I also just found the world not for me. I didn't think it was that cool. I find the Spren really stupid. And I think all of this is to say that like I just expected so much more. I went into this having read Brandon Sanderson before. I expected a certain level of high fantasy quality. Does he have the best prose? Absolutely not. I didn't go into it expecting good prose. I didn't go into it expecting to like feel for the characters super deeply, but I did expect quality world building. I expected quality plot and pacing, and I did not get that from this, unfortunately. I am still willing to give him a shot because I do have the next 2 books in the series on my shelves already. That was on me. That was stupid. And I will try them just simply because I've already spent the money on them, but I'm not loving this. It was such a slog to get through The Way of Kings, and I'm so deeply, deeply disappointed. And that's probably the only book I've read this year that was, I think, bad. Like, I did not like it. I did not think it was well done. There's just so many issues with it, and I'm just deeply, deeply disappointed. That's it. That's not a bad list. That's 5 books I've read at this point when I'm filming this, 40 books this year. So not horrific, and like I said, most of these are disappointing. Like, it's not that there's a bunch of bad books I read, so I'm very okay with this. I will definitely make a different video talking about books I have DNF'd, because there was also a sizable chunk of those as well, and that's kind of a different relationship I have to those books. Obviously, I've talked about one of them here because it was truly like a disappointment for me, but those, you know, had potential to be either really good or really bad, so keep your eye out for that because I do want to discuss those as well. And of course, I want to talk about the best books and my favorite books, so that will be coming as well. Let me know what your most disappointing book of the year was, or just the worst. Like, if you read something that truly made you think like, who the hell let this be published, please tell me. I would love to hear about it. My social media is linked down below. You guys can always come talk to me there. If you've seen me on TikTok a lot more than you've seen me here lately, mind your business. But I am active there if you do want to come talk to me. Other than that, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!